So far, an estimated 273 million people worldwide have contracted COVID-19, with over 5.4 million of those cases resulting in death. Now, I know some people might dispute, how those numbers are tallied, but either way, even if you were to somehow cut that number in half, what we can all agree on is that's still a lot of people. A large group of the world has been affected by this illness. In fact, we've experienced its effects right here in our own church. Some months ago, we had to cancel 2 services 2 weeks in a row because my family and Pastor Chris and his family came down with it. And just within this past week, over the holidays, we've had at least 3 families in the church who have contracted a new strain of it as well. Now, regardless of your perspective on COVID, I'm not interested in debating, whose fault it is or what the solutions are or anything like that. My point in saying this is that there's no denying that it's caused a chaotic stir these last 2 years. Regardless of how you think it should be handled or what you think the solution is, what we can all agree on is that it has touched every aspect of our lives. Our shopping, our traveling, our working, the role of the government, even church has been affected. And regardless of all our varied opinions on these things, we can hopefully agree that we don't want the spread to continue. But for as true as all that is, there is a far more deadly virus that is abounding in the world. There is a far more devastating disease of which we need to be aware. This virus has affected not just thousands or even millions of people, but every single person that has ever been born. This is a virus that has affected way more areas of life than the coronavirus ever could. This is a virus that many have attempted to solve in ineffective ways. This is a virus whose spread has wreaked chaos and devastation everywhere it goes. This is a virus that has resulted in not just the physical death of millions, but the spiritual, eternal death of millions upon millions. This virus is passed down not just through airborne droplets or contagions, but organically from conception and birth. We are carriers of it just by the very nature of being human beings descended from Adam and Eve. And I'm referring, of course, to a word that even though in English it's 3 short little letters, it is a big word that packs a cosmic punch. And that word, that virus, is sin. In our chapter today, we're going to see what this outbreak of sin looks like in this world now that mankind has inherited. In Genesis chapter 1 through 3, just to recap for you guys, we saw how God created all things good, and that includes men and women who were made in His image. They were designed to reflect His attributes and to administer His reign on earth. But under the enticement of the serpent, they try to assert their reign over God's. They don't want to be God's vice-regents. They want to take His place on the throne. But all that glitters is not always gold. And so what they thought was freedom actually led to enslavement and now being subject to the harsh whips of sin. And so now being fallen creatures, God banishes them from Eden, away from His presence, away from holy fellowship with Him, and they are now out, exiled into a fallen world. And so here in Genesis 4, as the story continues, we're going to see just how deep this sin runs. This sin that got introduced into the narrative in Genesis 3 that has infected Adam and Eve to their very nature. As they now branch out and as they are fruitful and as they multiply and as mankind begins to fill the earth, we begin to see what this ingrained sin begins to look like as it spreads out with mankind. We can see that this sin problem is not restricted to just Adam and Eve. It has now been passed down to their descendants. And as civilization spreads, so too will this outbreak of sin and all the problems that it brings. And so there's several things we'll consider this morning. And here's the first one. First, let's consider the outbreak of sin. The outbreak of sin. The reason for the outbreak is because sin is decay that comes from the heart. And you can see my subpoints there. Sin always deteriorates. Sin, like many illnesses, is degenerative. That means it is marked by progressive deterioration from bad to worse. In 1994, former President Ronald Reagan announced that he had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's. He told America that even though he felt fine at that moment, he knew what Alzheimer's entailed. He knew how it worked, and he knew it would just be a matter of time before he began the descent, as he called it, into the sunset. He knew that it was a deterioration that would only get worse. Sin is like a tumor. It starts off bad enough, but over time it becomes more malignant until it's taken over the entire body. Sin is like a tornado picking up speed and velocity as it goes. Sin is like a stain that spreads across the entirety of the fabric, and as it does, it gets darker the further it goes. The very nature of sin is never one of stagnation. It never just sits still as it is. It is always growing, and as it does, it brings with it deeper levels of decay and deterioration. And we see this deterioration, this digression happening even in Cain's actions. You know, Cain doesn't just wake up one morning and decide to go psycho. There was a series of compromises that leads to this horrific act of murdering his brother. The first thing we see in verse 5, look with me there, Cain feels jealousy, covetousness. He sees, God likes my brother's offering, but not mine. That's not fair. Abel has, and I have not. I desire my brother's favor. I desire my brother's blessing. And as he stews on that and thinks about it, that leads to his second compromise, and that is anger. As he contemplates this unfairness, his blood begins to boil. You ever have that happen where the more you stew on something, the more angry you become about it? Well, that anger leads to the next step, that internal fuming. At this point, this is all just in Cain's head and in his heart. At this point, he's just mulling it all over in here. But that internal fuming eventually spills over into external actions. So the next step is deception. In verse 8, he comes up to his brother and he invites him for a walk. A lovely stroll around the block and maybe some quality bro time. Come on, man, you and me, let's just go take a stroll, a nice friendly walk together. But of course, he's lying. He's deceiving his brother in order to harm him. And so the fourth step after that comes betrayal. Look at verse 9. Cain rose up against his brother. You know, the book of Proverbs says that a brother is made to be with you in adversity. The brother is the one who is meant to be by your side going through adversity. But this spins it on its head. Now the brother rises up and is a cause of adversity to his own brother. And that then leads to, fifthly, violence. The first murder in human history. You know, of all the murders, of all the wars, of all the genocides that have plagued human history, this is the first wretched first fruit of all of the violence and terror that has come in the years since. But you know, the slippery slope continues. Even after he's wreaked this violence, the next step is apathy to the suffering of others. Look in verse 9. When God questions him on it and says, "Where is your brother?" Cain says, "I don't know. I don't care. Not my problem." He just murdered his brother in cold blood, and he does not care. He has become now so calloused to the suffering of his brother. You see the degenerating effect that sin has in Cain? But it's not just Cain. Chapter 4 also shows us the degenerating effects of sin in mankind as a whole. So, for example, in Genesis chapter 2, God had established monogamy as the pattern for marriage. It says in Genesis 2:24, "A man," singular, "shall hold fast to his wife," singular, "and the two shall become one flesh," singular. But in Genesis chapter 4, verse 19, sin begins rotting this institution of marriage in a new and unprecedented way. Look what it says. It says, Lamech took 2 wives. The marriage and sexuality design has begun to be corrupted. There's another one we can see here too. In Genesis chapter 3, Adam and Eve, they try to avoid punishment. They're confronted by God, and they try to avoid punishment by shifting the blame to somebody else. They don't deny that they did something wrong. They just try to say it wasn't my fault. Right? So Adam and Eve try to avoid punishment by relocating the responsibility elsewhere. In Genesis 4, Cain tries to avoid punishment by straight up lying to God and denying all charges. And then it escalates even more, because in verses 23 and 24, we read about Lamech, who is one of Cain's descendants. Lamech also kills a man, but he doesn't try to reallocate blame. He doesn't try to deny it. He writes a song about it. If you look there, verses 23 and 24, the reason why it's formatted that way is because in the Hebrew language, this is structured like a poem or a song. So what was once shameful and was to try to be denied or avoided, he's now publicly celebrating. He is writing a song celebrating his own sin. So you see how what was once tried to be avoided, to being denied, is now being openly celebrated. This is the effect of sin. And this is true for all of us. Sin never sits still. It is always metastasizing into something more potent, something more deadly. And church, we need to be aware of this in our own lives. For what appears to be a harmless compromise, it can so rapidly swell into a hostile takeover. And you know the scariest thing about this sin, as you can see point B there, is that sin originates internally in the heart. I find this interesting. At the beginning of Genesis chapter 3, Adam and Eve were pure and sinless. So where did the sin come from? At the beginning of chapter 3, they're pure and sinless. The end of chapter 3, they're sinful and wretched. What changed? Well, the serpent introduced it. The sin comes from outside of themselves, right? The originating agent was a third party outside of Adam and Eve. But where does Cain's sin come from? Where does all of this originate? There's no serpent in the story. There's no, bad boys next door who are just a bad influence leading poor little innocent Cain astray. Where does it originate? In the wellspring of his own heart. Sin starts inside of him. Sin is no longer an outside force trying to work its way in. It's an inside force gushing its way out. James chapter 1:14 says this. It says, each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Jesus said in Mark chapter 7 verse 21, for within, from out of the heart, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, foolishness. On and on it goes. Where does it start? Jesus says right here. The other thing we can see is that sin dominates us. Look at verse 7. Look how God describes sin. Like a mighty beast crouching, ready to pounce and exercise dominion over him. You know, sin, I find this really interesting, that God uses the imagery of a wild animal to represent sin, because sin is exactly what the wild animals were, something that mankind was meant to take dominion over, but now it's been reversed, and it has dominion over them. Sin is not a tame house pet that you can keep on a leash, that you can leave out a little saucer of milk for, that you can keep on your lap and pet it and talk nice to it. Sin is a monster that only seeks to dominate. John Owen famously said, be killing sin or it will be killing you. And in Genesis 4, we see sin affecting everything. Worship, work ethic, attitudes, relationships. There is no area of life that this virus has not touched. What I want to do now, looking at the text, is focus on two of the primary ways in which this sin affects us. And so we can go to point number 2 here, and we can see there is an outbreak towards God. Let's go ahead and pull up our second slide this morning. This outbreak of sin is an outbreak towards God as seen in false worship. Now, brothers tend to have rivalries with each other. That's just the way it works. Me and my brother are 2 years apart. My boys are 2 years apart, and I can see from a young age there is just this built-in rivalry. I've got to one-up my brother. I've got to see who can have the coolest toys. I've got to see who can spit farther. I've got to see who can burp louder. There is just a built-in competition between brothers. And in today's story, Cain gets really ticked off when his brother's sacrifice is accepted, but his is not. And so a big question we might ask is, why? Why did God accept Abel's offering but not Cain's? There have been many theories suggested because the text itself doesn't tell us explicitly. It doesn't whack you over the head with the answer. You have to kind of deduce it. And so there have been multiple ideas that have been posited. I think that there's some good to be found in each of them. And so I'm actually going to present all 4 of them. Maybe all of them are true. Maybe just one of them is true. But either way, there's something important we can glean from each one. So here's the first one. False worship is half-hearted. Notice in verses 3 and 4 that when Abel worships God, it says he brings the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portions. The firstborn that was the first one to be born of the flock. That's the prize creature, the cream of the crop. And not only does he bring the choicest, the firstborn, but it says he also brings the fattest, juiciest parts of the firstborn. Abel could have kept the really tasty cuts of meat for himself and then given God the leftovers, but no, he surrenders the first choice and the highest quality of all that he has to God. Cain, meanwhile, it says, just brings fruit of the ground. Now, it doesn't say that he brought rotten fruit or bad fruit, but neither does it say he brought the first fruits. We would expect that, right? Like, Abel brings the firstborn of his herd. We would expect maybe Cain brings his first fruits, but no mention of first fruits. It's not that he brought bad fruit, it's just that it's not meaningful, heartfelt, or prioritized fruit. This is intentionally meant to contrast. The language that the author of Genesis used here is intentionally contrasting what Abel brought with what Cain brought. Abel brought the best of the best. Cain just brought, my scrappy seconds. And here's the thing about sin. Sin doesn't always mean that we stop worshiping God altogether. Sometimes what sin does is it brings us to worship Him in a half-hearted way, in a compromised way. God, you can have some of my life. God, you can have a piece of my life, but I'm keeping most of it for myself. Lord, you can have some of my time if my busy schedule permits at the end of the day. If I've got some scraps of time for you, God, you can have those. I'll use a little of my talents, but not too seriously. All of my pursuits are more important than what you want me to do, God. I'll let you have some of my abilities. I'll serve you occasionally, but only if I'm not too tired with all this other stuff. I'll give up some of my pet sins, but there's some I just got to hang on to. There's some I just can't bear to part with. But no, worship is meant to be the surrender of all of ourselves before the throne of God, the choicest of our heart. But because of sin, what we often do is we give God the leftovers instead of the prized parts of the flock. But the other thing sin does is we can see false worship is worship without faith. At the same time, what makes Abel's sacrifice more acceptable was not simply the content of the offering, but the heart behind the offering. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 4 says this, "By faith, Abel offered a sacrifice to God more acceptable than Cain, through which he was commended as righteous." God commending him by accepting his gift. Did you hear that? Why does the author of Hebrews say that Abel's offering was more acceptable? Because he did it with faith. That is, Abel's offering wasn't accepted just because it was an impressive sirloin that was marinated to perfection. It was because behind that offering there was a heart of humble faith in God. Faith means far more than just intellectually believing that God exists. Faith is more than just an acknowledgement that there's a big man upstairs. Faith is a humble dependency on God. Faith means trusting God, abiding in God. It means an all-out conviction for who God is and a deep-rooted assurance of what God has promised to do. Here's what faith is. Faith is a heart totally surrendered in trust to God. And so the psalmist would say in Psalm 51, verses 16 and 17, "For you will not delight in sacrifice, or I would give it. You will not be pleased with a burnt offering. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit. A broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise." Isn't it so easy to come to church, sing along with all the songs, tithe $1 million, slap a fish bumper sticker on your car, wear the cheesy Christian t-shirts that rip off name brands like Coca-Cola and Starbucks, but they've just got the name Jesus slapped in there? It's so easy to do that. But the most Christian-y acts that you can do don't mean anything if they are void of humble trust in Jesus Christ. The other thing about false worship is it is done without atonement. Some have speculated that the difference between Cain and Abel comes down to how they thought they could approach God in worship. Both of them offered sacrifices or offerings, but here's a big difference. While Cain brings the fruit of the ground, he's bringing the work of his hands, he's bringing the fruit of his own labor. What does Abel bring? Abel brings a sacrificial offering. This is continuing what we saw with Adam and Eve in Genesis chapter 3, verse 21. How did God clothe Adam and Eve? What was the covering for their nakedness? How was their shame of sin covered up? Through the first animal sacrifice. An animal had to die in order to cover them for their sin. So some commentators have speculated that perhaps there's a bit of this going on here. Perhaps Cain thinks he can impress God with his work, while Abel recognizes, I can only approach God through the substitution of a sacrifice. Through the atoning blood of an offering, of a sacrifice, can I approach God. I am not worthy to come to God on my own merits. My sins have to be paid for by the blood of a sacrifice. When we worship, church, we do not approach God on the basis of our labor or worthiness. It is only through the definitive, once and for all sacrifice of Jesus Christ, the pure and spotless Lamb. We cannot enter the Holy of Holies unless it be by the sacrifice of the spotless Lamb. And so Jesus famously said in John 14:6, "No one comes to the Father except through me. Now, the last thing here, false worship is done on our own terms. However you interpret this difference between Cain and Abel, what is true either way is this. Cain wanted to worship God on Cain's terms, not God's. Look what God says to him in verses 6 and 7. Why are you angry? Why has your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? You know what this implies to me? This implies that Cain already knew the way God desired to be worshipped. God tells him, Cain, what are you throwing a pouty fit over? You should have known ahead of time. You knew better, and yet you decided to, like Frank Sinatra saying it, I did it my way. You decided to do things the way you wanted to do them. You wanted to worship on your terms. I already laid out for you how I'm to be worshipped, and yet you decided to do it your way. Sin makes us think that we can worship God as we see fit. Worship, we think, revolves around me, my terms, my preferences, not God. But if the story of Cain and Abel tells us anything, it's that when God graciously invites us to come and worship Him and fellowship with Him, it's to be done on His terms. Now, the third thing we see this morning, not only has there been an outbreak towards God in false worship, but our third point this morning, there's been an outbreak towards others, seen in selfishness and in betrayal. Sin has also produced dastardly results in man's relationship with other people. And so what sin does is it causes us to magnify ourselves over other people. At the heart of Cain's actions towards his brother is this idea that what he thinks, what he feels, what he wants is more important than the life of his brother Abel. Just like false worship is saying, my preferences are more important than God. So sin against other people is, my desires are more important than this other person. The heart of our conflict with other people is when we elevate the self and ourselves over other people. That me, I am the most important thing. Me being right. Maybe you're in a dispute with your spouse, and me being right is more important than their feelings. My opinion at work and making sure we do things my way is more important than my relationship with my coworkers. I've got a goal, and other people are just a hindrance towards that goal. And as soon as we see people that way, as soon as we see other people as obstacles to be overcome or even eliminated to get what we want, it's only a matter of time before the internal fuming of Cain spills over into external acts of betrayal and even violence. Which is why 1 John 3:11 and 12 warns us, for this is the message you have heard from the beginning, that we should love one another. We should not be like Cain, who was of the evil one and murdered his brother. But you know, the other thing about sin is that it also has social effects. Cain's actions against his brother have ramifications on everybody else around him. Look at verses 12 and 16. God tells Cain, you shall be a fugitive and a wanderer. And verse 16 says, Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod. So at this point in man's early history, everybody still lives in the same general area. But now this extended family of Adam and Eve has now been disrupted. Cain is now ostracized from the family, leaving a trail of heartache in his wake. Now, as a quick note, some people might wonder, well, where do all these people come from? Right? Cain and Abel were, if they were the first two children born, how are there talks about groups of people or cities or stuff like that? Well, as we'll see in chapter 5, people at this early stage in history lived to be like 900 years old. And this is in the days before birth control. So you do the math. If you're living to be 900 years old and there's no birth control, you could easily, in a lifetime, have like 300 kids. Even if you just have kids every couple of years. Now, imagine if 300 kids now have 300 kids. Suddenly you're up to 90,000 people. So we can see the population rising pretty quickly. So, and we don't know how long this is after Cain and Abel. We always show pictures of Cain and Abel like they're, young 20-something bucks, but they could be 100, 200, 300 years old for all we know. We don't know at this point. But the fact of the matter is it's been long enough that the population has swelled and there's other groups of people. But the point here is that sin always takes a toll on everyone around us. Disputes always, even if it's just between you and one other person, you think this is a little private affair with me and this one person. But sin always tears the social fabric right down the middle. Think about a workplace controversy. Think about a family feud. Think about a church split. These might start as just beef between two people, but they never stay that way. Sin always has ramifications far beyond just you and that other person. And I saw a picture this week that it was something I had never really thought of before. I'm really into a lot of old art, and I especially love some of like the medieval and Renaissance art, and you find so many beautiful depictions of biblical scenes. Well, I found one that was a little later than that. It was from 1888, and it's a piece of art called The First Morning. Not mourning, M-O-R-N, but M-O-U-R-N. The first morning, the first grieving. And it's a picture of Adam and Eve weeping over Abel's body. Adam and Eve are huddled up close together with the dead body of their son draped over their laps. And Adam looks distraught. He doesn't know what to make of it. Eve is cupping her face in her hands. And there is the gray, lifeless face of their son in their lap. And it was such a devastating picture. Because, Adam and Eve, they had heard of death before. When God pronounced the curse, they knew they would die. But as far as we can tell from the Bible, this is their first real experience with it. They had never encountered it. And I can't help but put myself in their place and imagining what they must have felt like when they come upon the corpse of their son. You can imagine them trying to shake him awake, trying to call his name, looking into those eyes that had once been so bright and represented new life to them, now grayed over with death. And you can imagine, if you've ever experienced loss, you know that punched in the gut feeling that comes out of nowhere. And Adam and Eve experienced that for the first time. They don't know where it is or where it's come from, but they're experiencing this devastation. And it's this feeling of loss that had never been felt before. And now that would be wretched enough, but now add insult to injury. And who was it that did that? It was their other son. This ultimate betrayal must have gutted and devastated Adam and Eve. As parents, you try so hard to shelter your kids from the evil that's out there. And as Christian parents, we should. We try to be very careful about what they watch or who they hang out with. That's good. But you know what? We can't fail to lose account of the sin that still resides within them. And Adam and Eve would have learned, devastatingly so, that sin is something that resides in us all. But despite all of this bad news and the outbreak of sin, there's one final point we need to consider this morning, and that is this, the fourth and final point, and that is God's outbreak of grace towards us, as seen in what's called common grace and saving grace. Something as powerful and pervasive as sin requires a solution more powerful yet. The virus, the outbreak of sin requires an antidote that is even more potent. But this antidote, this healing, it can't come from within us. That's where the sin comes from. The solution has to come from outside of us. And that's what grace is. Grace is God reaching down from the outside and introducing His grace, His deliverance, His mercy, His redemption, introducing it into the equation. Grace must come from the hand of God reaching mercifully in. And so there's two different ways in the chapter this morning we see God's grace manifested. One is what's called common grace. In common grace, that is God preserving and prospering fallen man. Common grace, think about it this way, is the everyday blessings that God showers on everybody, regardless of their salvation status, regardless of whether they are wicked or regardless of whether they are innocent. God bestows certain creation blessings on everybody. Jesus described it as God sends His rain on the just and on the unjust. It's called common because it's everywhere. You can't turn around without bumping into it. You can't take a breath without sucking it in. God has showered blessings of preservation and prosperity upon all mankind. And Genesis 4, for all of its human failures, also features some incredible displays of this common grace. For example, in verse 15, after Cain has done this horrible thing, he offers a sacrifice he knows God won't like, he kills his brother, he lies to God about killing his brother, and what does God do? God protects Cain by putting this divine mark on him so that other people don't try to take revenge. Now, we don't know what the mark is. There have been some weird speculations. I don't think it's really important. The important thing here is that the Creator is continually showing patience with His fallen creatures. Now, this is not to excuse Cain. God certainly has zero approval for what Cain did, but it shows us that even in the midst of his judgments, God shows these mercies all along the way. And in verses 17 through 22, we see not only does God preserve sinners' lives, he keeps Cain alive, just like everyone in this room. We've all sinned, and yet God keeps supplying our lungs with breath. You could think about the worst, cruelest dictator who's ever lived, and yet every waking moment that they're alive is an act of mercy on God's part. So not only does he preserve their life, but in verses 17 through 22, we see God also prospers people. Look at what he does for Cain and his family. They go on to become great cultivators and inventors. In verse 17, Cain builds the first city. In verse 20, Jabal is the first farmer of multiple types of herds. In verse 21, Jubal invents musical instruments. Tubal-Cain, in verse 22, creates different tools. What we read here is the thriving of human culture. And even in our world today, even you might have people who have utterly dismissed the gospel of Jesus Christ, and yet God still blesses humanity with so many provisions and talents. People can still enjoy the warmth of the sunshine, refreshing rainfall, delicious food, the company, the laughter of loved ones, the blessing of marriage and children. People, even the most debauched heathen, can still sing beautiful songs, paint masterful art, construct magnificent towers, make advances in medicine, accomplish great things, and all while using the borrowed breath and ability of the very God they've rejected. What we see here in this chapter is, yes, man's sin, but God's incredible patience with them. But there's not just that common grace, there's also saving grace as well. There's this looking ahead to the saving grace by which God would send the Messiah to save us from our sins. Saving grace isn't just blessing us despite our sin and death. Saving grace is more specific. It's blessing us by saving us from sin and death. Now, I want us to think about something. We just recently finished our Advent series, and that was a time of remembering the expectation of God's people as they waited for the Messiah to arrive. That expectation went all the way back to Adam and Eve. When we were in Genesis chapter 3, we saw that chapter 3, verse 15, was the proto-evangelium. It was the first preaching of the gospel, where despite Adam and Eve's sin, God promised that a son would be born of the woman who would crush the serpent's head, undo the curse, and bring them back to the restored Garden of Eden. Now, in that promise of Genesis 3:15, God never specified who the son would be or when he would arrive on the scene. All Adam and Eve knew is that it would be a son born of a woman. And in the time since then, they've experienced the sting of the fallen world. Every prick of the thorn brush, every labor pain, every sin against one another must have felt all the more grievous to them as they are anticipating the one who will come and redeem them from it. And so with that in mind, I want to back up to verse 1 of Genesis chapter 4. Ask us to put ourselves in Adam and Eve's position. When the very first son ever to be born comes into the world, it is not hard to imagine that they may have had some messianic expectations riding on him. Again, they never knew when this son would come or who he would be. All they knew is that it would be a son born of the woman. So when the son is born of the woman, maybe Adam and Eve start thinking, maybe this is the one we've been waiting for. In fact, many scholars and commentators have actually remarked that although it gets lost in our English translations, the way that the Hebrew language originally captures Eve's words actually makes it sound like she does believe this is the son, this is the special son that God has earlier promised. And this is reflected in his name, Cain, which means gotten. We've gotten him. Unto us the son is given. Here he is. So on one hand, you've got to admire Eve's faith, that Eve is excited that this Redeemer will come and will save them. But, it's only a matter of time before they realize the hard way that Cain is not the one they're waiting for. Perhaps some of those angry tendencies on Cain's part were evident even when he was a little kid. Maybe it's just the fact that every kid, regardless of what a blessing they are, they evidence their imperfections very early on. But it did not take them very long to realize that the one to crush the serpent, to bring them back to the garden, it's not Cain. And in fact, that's reflected, I think, in the name of their second son. What do they name him? Abel. Abel is from the Hebrew word that means vain or vanity. It's the exact same Hebrew word we see in Ecclesiastes chapter 1, where it says, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. It's void, it's empty. And I can't help but wonder, maybe that's because with Cain, they had optimism. They were full of hope. Here he is. But then time goes by and they realize this kid is just as messed up as we are. And so their hope now begins to feel a little void. It begins to feel a little empty. Their hope feels in vain. Now, of course, Abel isn't perfect either, but he did turn out to be a very godly man who loved the Lord. And as we'll see in verse 25, this expectation began to formulate, okay, well, maybe Cain isn't the one, but could it be Abel? Abel's a pretty good guy. Maybe Abel is the one to do the delivering. But then comes that crippling loss with Abel's death. With his last breath, it is the extinguishing of not just their beloved son, but their hope in God's promises. And now, what do you have on your hands if you're Adam and Eve? You've got one son who's wicked and one son who's dead. Between the two of them, which one is qualified to be the Messiah? Neither of them. One is wicked, one is dead. Neither can be the deliverer. You would need a son who was perfect and righteous, unlike Cain, and a son who could defeat death, unlike Abel. In fact, the picture I use, I love this. Casey, let's go up and pull up the title card again here for this message. The picture I use, this is by an artist named Gustav Doré. He painted it in 1866, and it's actually cropped. If you were to see the full picture, you would actually see the body of Abel sprawled out on the ground in front of Cain. But I want you to notice something. Look on the ground, on the bottom right side of the screen. What do you see there on the ground? It's a serpent whose head remains intact. Cain hadn't crushed the serpent's head, he crushed his own brother's. Abel hadn't crushed the serpent's head, his own head got crushed in. You can imagine the crushed hope of Adam and Eve in these stories. And maybe you can relate with that idea of crushed hope. Maybe the reality of sin has you discouraged this morning. Maybe it's the sin you see in yourself. Maybe it's the sin you see on the news. Maybe it's the sin you see in your own children. Maybe it's the betrayal of a loved one. Maybe it's the loss you feel over a loved one. Maybe, like Eve, you're starting to feel disillusioned. You start to wonder if things aren't void and vain. You know, we start the new year bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. This is my year. I'm going to make it happen. And then by December 31st, we're like scraping ourselves across the floor, our tail between our legs. We get this rising hope, and then it gets extinguished so easy. And just like Adam and Eve, all this expectation we have in what God's going to do so often seems unfulfilled. All that hope, all that anticipation, God's promises might seem thwarted. They might seem like vanity. Like Adam and Eve, we are ready for things to be made new. Adam and Eve are ready for the new son to bring them back to the new restored creation. But no human effort, no New Year's resolution, no matter how dramatic, can ever change our need. The solution's not to be found there. Instead, what I want us to do, and we can go back to our final point, let's see together their renewal of faith. Adam and Eve, although they might feel like hope is in vain, their faith is about to get a boost. They're about to see this testimony of God's grace still in effect, still in action. Look at verse 25. What does it say? Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and called him Seth. For she said, God has appointed for me another offspring instead of Abel. The righteous line didn't perish with Abel. It's renewed again with a new son. And it says he is appointed. Cain was corrupt. Abel was dead, but Seth is now the appointed one to carry on those promises of Genesis 3:15. And I think it's important. The word that's used here in 4:25, offspring, it's the same word used in Genesis 3:15 about the offspring to crush the serpent. And so their hope gets renewed. You can sense the returned optimism. God has not forgotten. Out of the ashes, God has risen up his promise once again. And the righteous line that will produce this son, it will continue. And that's exactly what we see in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 3. There we find Jesus' lineage, and it traces his lineage all the way back to the beginning. And listen to what verse 38 says. It says, he is the son of Seth, who was the son of Adam. Seth is now the participant in this messianic line, and all the hopes of sin's antidotes and cures are renewed with him. And this coming descendant of Seth, the Messiah, yes, he would also die at the hands of evil men, just like Seth, or just like Abel would. But you know what the difference was? 3 days later, he rose again to defeat sin and death forever. And so what does this produce? This arrival of Seth, the renewal of the Messianic line. Look at verse 26. At the very end, at that time, people began to call upon the name of the Lord. There's this renewed sense of worship, a reignited sense of hope as more people now begin to publicly come together to call upon God's name. With the arrival of Seth and his line, there's this renewal. Oh, and church, may this news stir our hearts, renew our faith and our confidence in what God will do this morning. May this New Year's hope fill us with new praise. Just like it did back then, the arrival of Seth, it's almost made it sound like the arrival of Seth is kind of what sets off this new revival of praise. There's this recognition God's not done. And may that recognition on this New Year's also spark a renewed worship and praise in us. Church, as we wrap up, let's just consider, let's recognize the severity of the sin in ourselves. We must recognize how quickly it deteriorates and compromises us, how it originates from within us, how it dominates us. Let us recognize the many ways that it leads us into false worship of God and the wrong treatment of others. But let's also, with that bleak picture in mind, against that black night sky, now we see the sunrise all the clearer. Now we behold its cure, its solution, the descendant of Seth. He is the truly appointed one. He is the one who brings the healing for this disease in his wings. He is the one who dies as the definitive sacrifice, whose blood offering cleanses us once and for all. He is the firstborn Lamb of God. It is only through his substitution that we may come to the altar, worship God again. And so we too can now call upon the Lord in worship. A worship that surrenders all of our hearts before his grace. A worship that trusts in him fully. A worship that is done on his terms. And a worship that comes exclusively through the saving blood of Jesus Christ alone. May that give us hope in this new year. And with that, I'm going to ask my brother Chris to come forward. He's going to conclude our service with the time of the Lord's Supper as we remember and proclaim Jesus, the pure and spotless sacrifice who died to save us from this sickness.